Aaron.
And that was in mono. This is
Yes,
we
that's-
mixed actually this in Atmos, so usually it envelops you. This
Yeah.
whole data worlds.
But beyond our control. In terms of Aaron, as the writer and the editor on this, how did this scene come about?
Sure. Well, sorry. Well, so I was editor along with Pedro, who's here, and Kareem also. Sorry, not editor, writer along with Pedro and Kareem, who isn't here. And this was a tricky scene because, you know, documentary is an industry, or sorry, a filmmaking process where you depend on what elements you have in the beginning, right? And then you build up from that foundation. So with this scene, it wasn't like there was a verite scene cut for it or ready-made animation. So all we really had was David, the main character's voice, talking about this world and this problem that was occurring. And so the first thing we did was think about what is the shape of that story, since that is really the only element we have, and what's the best way to tell it that will have a sonic and visual arc to it. And this is stealing a line from Pedro, but it's starting with this idea of beauty and ending up sort of realizing you're in a wreckage site. That seemed to have the clearest sound and visual and dramatic arc. And so the first thing we did was build that with David's voice. But then from there, you know, it's an incredibly complex process to build this animation, and it usually comes much later, and we hadn't shot the visual plates to cover it. So to figure out what's going to work and enable our imaginations to think of what could work, the next step was to build a Temp Sound Bed that could trace not the literal nature of what he's saying, but help us inhabit a space we thought we should be inhabiting for that arc. So we started very much with real world textures. We imagined he'd be walking around in the world as you see him. And so with no visuals, I just laid down a bed of, you know, outside city noises, car horns, birds chirping.
So when you say the plates, so at this point you hadn't shot any of the stuff with David in the subway
We
or
shot
walking
nothing.
No, the stuff of him walking in Union Square and going to Subway, that was shot after. We had some temp shots of him sometimes and some archival that we also pulled, but it was really that came after we constructed the narrative.
Yes, this didn't look like anything for a long time. It sounded like his voice, and then it sounded like the next step was to sort of make it sound like a podcast that you could live in and experience and help inspire and help us imagine. So then once we imagined we were going to enter what we were calling the wormhole, even before we spoke with an animator, then it was a matter of choosing a temp track that felt like the sound was going from being something we're experiencing external to ourselves to something that became incredibly introspective and very that sounded very in ourselves, I guess is the best way to put it. And so the temp score I chose is nowhere near the brilliant score that Gil did, but these are all sketches, right? I felt my role was to sketch these things out so that then they could be revised and fleshed out and made pretty and beautiful. So the first step was laying that sound bed, and then they went out and shot the plates based on our blocking. So then there was and of course the plates were only up until that animation, the full 3D animation, well, it's, you know, 3D feeling animation starts, the wormhole where it
We
comes
just
at
used
you.
to have a card that said temp animation here.
Right.
That lasted for a
Months
few
and
minutes.
months. Yeah, that lasted for a long
Probably
time.
had that for months.
Right. But once we shot the visuals, and I did lay the visuals in, and then it was a matter of adjusting the sound bed I laid to fit the picture. And so then it was more about complementing rather than inspiring. But the wormhole remained this place that was sort of TBD. But at that point, Gil started giving, he did compose very early on, once we had those visual plates, a track that helped us feel that shift, which again inspired another sketching time of the sound, and we just sort of went back and forth like that until we finally did get the 3D animation from Ash, and for the wormhole, and I went in and did another very temp sketch. But again, this was all sketch, not shiny bells and whistles, just meant to test. I think of myself as like testing, will this work? We don't want to bet the money on the horse that isn't going to work.
And the once you're into that sort of card, and Gil comes on, but the animation's not quite there yet. How did the timing for all that sort of come about? Because there's space for the effects that come in later, and did that develop naturally?
Well, it did. We first had it sort of laid out. We kind of imagined what it would be when we began to work with Ash Thorpe, who created the animation of the data wormhole. We kind of blocked out the beats, and he gave us these animatronics, which are these sort of gray circles that float in space, giving us sort of an idea what the timing was going to be. And the thing is, we had to actually, the really difficult thing was we had to lock this opening section by months before, like it was more than 2 months before we actually locked picture overall, because of the animation was really tricky. So at first we just kind of had to imagine what the beats were going to be. We had talked in advance, and then we kind of locked in the temp. Even the VO we locked in then was pretty temp. We continued to tweak the language, but sort of the timing overall was actually pretty locked. And then as the animatronics came on, the sketching began. And one of the great things with working with Gil is that there is a great back and forth. So Gil did an initial sketch. We kind of hunkered down and kind of discussed sort of like what the beats were happening. Really kind of honed in sort of the journey and trajectory from sort of this beauty and hope of a connected world, right? This glossy exterior to a more a dark underbelly and really kind of hone in. But it's really great to start working with original score, and Gil's such a great collaborator that we can actually kind of finesse that together, because otherwise to do that with a temp score would have been even harder for us on the editorial front.
And when did sound design come into that process?
Well, I mean, early on in November, I think we called you, right, Tom? And we said, hey, we have this thing. It might happen. Then we showed it to him. I don't know which version you saw first, but I think there was a lot of temp animations and some sketches. But it was sort of like a bare bones world, but there was a lot to fill in.
Yes, indeed. This was a Sundance project. It premiered at Sundance, and as is typical for a Sundance project, for us as sound people who are the last people to work on, as you know, as a post-super, it's always rather squeezed, and especially when you're doing animation, you don't have the final version of it, which is critical because every little detail of animation needs a sound. We don't have that until the very end. So we played around and did some drafts, and they had done some wonderful work in the temp that gave us a good guide for what to do. And we had a general shape for probably a month, I guess, throughout January. But then when the final animation hit, then we really went to work as a team, and we had, I think, 5 or 6 people on it, and we were just dividing and conquering.
I mean, it definitely feels like you had input sort of early enough on to make sure that, because there's a lot of sound effects in the 3D space that have a chance to play, and sort of really, it doesn't feel like it's following the animation. It feels like it's all a organic whole, which indicates that there was definitely thought in those early stages about giving beats, like not just dialogue beats, but also sound effect beats and stuff in there.
There was a lot of space in it, and Gil and I worked together a lot with, deciding on who's sort of hitting what beat or in the range of things that you need with the textures and the low frequencies and the mids and the hits and the beds and all that stuff. We were in constant dialogue about kind of who's covering what for any given moment, and the animation is just incredibly brilliant. It was a very inspiring canvas.
That process is fascinating, the sort of the divvying up of work, which we talked a little bit before, but in terms of being very specific, not just in terms of how you're divvying up the auditory space in terms of time, but also in terms of frequency and all of that. I was going to jump into the next clip, which is the music.
Sure. I just want to respond to because I think one of the beautiful things on this project was so oftentimes in films and especially in documentaries, music, works alone, sound works alone, and then at the very end in the mix you kind of pray and hope that everything sticks together. And we knew that especially for this opening clip, there's so much going on that would be a disaster. So the collaboration early on, it was really this beautiful puzzle. I remember sitting in the studio and, we talked about beats and we decided that, the music was going to carry more the emotion in broad brushstrokes so that sound could really catch things, which music doesn't want to do anyways because it starts sounding Mickey Mousey, so this is more about broad brushstrokes. And then, also that allowed for the back and forth in editing, to be really efficient. And so, the other thing I have to mention is that as a composer, to write themes early on and give it to the editorial crew can go horribly right or horribly wrong, depending on how good the editor is with music. And in this case, I'd worked with Erin many times before, and so I knew that I could put the music there and it would be a great thing, rather than things really end up being, no pun intended, but the great hack as far as how things are, and then it becomes really hard for the composer to make sense of beats and all of that. So, yeah, it was great.
And one of the things I think is not even apparent necessarily where the boundary is between the effects and the music and the clip that we just saw. So the next clip that we have is music only, and it's a portion of the first scene that we've already seen. So let's go ahead and roll that.
I can just talk over it as we.
And when you you as an editor, you were actually given certain stems from the composer that you were able then to use on your own, which some editors I've worked with love that process, like on Halston, that was done hugely. On other projects, the editor would sort of run away from sort of that level of music editing. How did that process work between the two of you?
It worked great.
Great, thank you. It's interesting. The open was probably the exception to this. I think the open is the one piece that, with the exception of doing a music edit here and there when I had to change timing before we locked, that really was Gil's baby. From the beginning all the way through sending it off to college. So that was the exception. But I think with a lot of the other scenes, what we talked about, and one of the things I've learned from Gil working over the years is just like a narrative arc is important across an entire feature film, not only across a single scene, so is the music arc across an entire film. And that's one of the reasons I most enjoy working with Gil is very early on when we talk about, okay, from an emotional standpoint, what is your climax? What's the high point? What's the low point? And we talk about it emotionally. And temp score is great and helpful to push along the process, but when I get to work with themes early on, then that begins that dialogue sooner. And the execution of what's spoken about as far as making sure, okay, well, I used the horn stem and the string stem and the drum stem in this scene, but this scene is actually not the climax of the film, so I've gone too far. And to be able to have that shorthand language and those stems to work with and say, yes, let's use that theme there, but let's peel this back because we want it to sound familiar to that scene or that scene. But as far as that narrative strand goes, we've advanced beyond that or we're not that advanced. it's an incredibly helpful back and forth, and I think it actually helps the edit feel better sooner and exposes sometimes when I've made a mistake in my storytelling, because it's like, well, the biggest version of this track is all that works because the scene needs to be so big, but maybe the scene shouldn't be so big at this part of the film because it feels really wonky.
And I have to add that it also makes the music so much better. You know, because I would write these theme packages, you know, these themes, and give the stems, and then the scene would come back. And you know, Erin and Pedro are both closet composers, and they're amazing at it. And I would be incredibly surprised at like, oh, like this usage, these stems, this way, something I would never have thought of. And so it's a really cool way to go back and forth and keep everything really fresh, because I think it's so easy to get bogged down into detail and not see other ways of doing things. And when creative collaboration is like this, it just feeds on itself, which is, I love it.
And so, Jeremy, when, in terms of sound design, sort of as this process is going, when do you come in? When did you come in?
Yeah, so I sort of got a little bit of a head start thinking about the abstract sonic elements. I sort of see it almost as if my job is to kind of build up this mass of beautiful marble and then hand it off to Tom to carve it and really shape it with these other elements. Because at that stage in the process, I don't necessarily have full access to the music, or I have access to dialogue, but maybe it's not exactly right. So on this project, I was super lucky in that I could treat it in such a way where I started making sounds without necessarily even knowing where they would be placed yet, and really thinking about them in relation to story. So thinking about, okay, how can we make sounds that not only support the visual elements rhythmically, but also contribute to the story. So how can I take sort of maybe more traditional organic sounds that match in rhythm to the picture and extract kind of digital aspects of them? Or I did a lot of recording of radio interference and cell phone interference. I did a lot of stuff where I took sounds and used tools that traditionally would be used to remove digital interference or digital artifacting, and I ran them in reverse and got only those artifacts. So finding ways to kind of like find the digital leakage of the sonic world and create a whole building kit. And at that point, I started to cut in those sounds to places where it felt appropriate. So it was sort of like casting a wide net, making a lot of sounds that seemed appropriate to the story, and then finding their place.
And did you basically start that process sort of in a thematic world, or were you already seeing material at that point? Because the animation definitely didn't exist.
When I was involved, the animation did exist, yeah. So it was sort of, Tom pulled me in right before that first Sundance cut, and I think I had like maybe a day or two to like get started, and that sort of got me thinking. And then when we returned to it a few months later, I was like, okay, like I have an idea. We have all these visuals of the sort of fragmented data leakage. How can we make sounds that support those ideas, or the little bubbles, all the interface bubbles and stuff like that?
And Tom, when did you first see the opening sequence?
I guess was it January?
No, I think you saw it in either late November, early December.
Yeah, it wasn't as refined.
No,
it was
it wasn't.
it was a shape.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it wasn't something creating the sounds, it's hard to do too much before you have a close to final version, because it's all about the details and the exact timing. And when things are still evolving, it's hard to do. We can sort of get ideas but we didn't really start until it was quite close to final, which was mid-January.
Yeah. Gotcha.
I mean, we did this in two waves. We did the Sundance version, which involved like a 37-hour day, I think. It was some insanity.
Wow, like a long slog.
Yeah, it was just like literally we had, I think, a week, and we had everyone, and we just went
My
like
heart
crazy.
just started racing.
I know.
And
I know.
the first, it was 2 days of a mix. The first was a 12-hour day, followed by a 37-hour day.
Yeah, I think it was like 1 o'clock in the morning, and we were trying to get the temp mix, and I was like, okay, let's start with reel 3, and Pedro's like, well, we don't have the music yet, but Gil's going to have it to us in an hour. And the screening was 2 days later at Sundance or something like that. It was one of those, but then we had more time when we came back. But I was always thinking regarding the sound design. I was thinking about 3 elements. I was thinking about the sounds that we all hear, the notifications, right? the actual literal sounds of this world of data that's all around us. And then there was the second thing was the unseen, the unheard, the non-existent sounds that are sort of the concept of what, because we did this animation of the data leakage and everything else, and just coming up with a sound approach for that was the second thing. And then the third thing was sort of the emotional side of it, and that was more kind of just like low tones and this and that, and working with Gil's music and creating the feeling of what the story was being told beyond it.
Great. So
I was just going to say there's some really cool moments where those elements cross over. So, for instance, there's a moment, I forget where in the film, but there's a moment, or maybe a few moments where you see a pedestrian walk by, and it's sort of a real-world moment, but you hear it's as if their cell phone, the GSM signal from their cell phone, is sort of being picked up by the microphone, like sort of fun moments of crossover like that. I think were really exciting.
Yeah.
This is great. So we'll show the next clip, which is now the sound effect, the sound design version of the scene we've just seen. What I was noticing is that this does not have any of the sort of like the ambient sounds or the real world sounds in it, right? Like in the final mix, we have, we hear subway noise, we hear him like David in the classroom, sort of low. This is now just the design sound, sort of working through sort of the themes and all of that. So let's go ahead and play clip 3. So at the beginning, so it starts more realistic, and then it gets more unrealistic, or not, but more conceptual.
Well, there was a moment where it goes into slow motion, and that was so we had sort of the glittery sounds and the hints at the world we were implying, and then it goes into slow motion, and that's where it really started.
Yeah.
And this played quite low in level, so it wasn't as impactful as we were mixing it, but that's where it really started, and then it kind of...
Yeah, you go into that invisible world. The red hallway is kind of like this portal. And but one thing that once you enter that portal, the slow motion, you start hearing winds, and that's something we played with all along. It's this very, in a way, it's we played a lot with different sorts of winds and the high frequency, the sparkling sound of the data, which is something almost kind of like passing through you, and really kind of this stealth hand that's really kind of enveloping our worlds and stealing and taking and harvesting our. So that's sort of the harvesting metaphor that we brought with the wind.
Well, and there's this tension too that we talked about from the beginning between the glossy sounds that the manufacturers and creators of these devices want us to associate with our devices, right? And those are the sounds that kind of hypnotize us and draw us in, and are the sounds of our relationships and draw to the device on the surface. But in that opening, as we're trying to hint that this film is going to be about taking that lid off, going through the screen, I think that's where you hear the shift from the noises we're familiar with to the more invisible, is a weird word to use with sound, but invisible sounds. And so, I think Jeremy and Tom Paul did an amazing job of imagining and creating what that soundscape might be, because it isn't one that exists, and that's sort of the whole point. And I think wind is an especially interesting device to use, since unlike most things that make sound, wind isn't made by something that actually creates sound. It's always invisible and always sweeping through and just sort of there, as is data.
Exactly. And the other thing is what Jeremy and Tom, what you guys did in terms of really the personalization, even things that are familiar to us, but using that in a way that's so personal, like even down to like the emojis. The emojis don't necessarily have a sound, but it sounded so familiar. What even you brought to that that ways is which we used to express our own emotions, and I think you really brought that to life in a way that was really incredible and developing.
Some of those were my own voice. I had an awkward encounter with my neighbors when they asked me if everything was okay when they heard it through the wall.
Emojis are Brought to you by Jeremy. Yes.
How did y'all make the pop sound again too? Wasn't that?
So it's interesting. Gil mentioned the use of modular synthesis, and so that actually I used the same process, although not in a sort of purely musical way. So I have a modular synth, and I sort of did it as a kind of it's a technique I like to use a lot. It's a kind of a curatorial technique where I generated tons and tons of material with it, almost in a randomized way, and then curated the sounds from that sort of felt most appropriate. And with moments like that, because there are a few layers and there's so many variations, I think the thing to really sell moments like that is that they're just putting variation in each one, so it's not like the same sound over and over and over again, but it sort of has texture and sort of treating it almost as you would music in that sense.
Are any of the sounds actual sounds from actual devices, or did you remake pretty much everything?
Yeah, so like when you see a Facebook like, it is the sound of a Facebook like, but when you see some other thing, it's not. So we tried to keep it very specific like that.
And it seemed that the burden of the transition from the sort of like the normal world into the slow motion world into the data world, it felt like the transition fell heavily on the sound effects. The music kind of glided through it much more slowly, but the whole sort of slowdown and the very conscious sort of change was more in the sound design. Is that?
I'd say even more so probably in the mix, in that I kind of like created this canvas, handed it to them, and then Tom can speak to it, but like Tom was able to listen to the music. There was this amazing moment where there was a moment that was very dense at first, and Pedro was like, do you know that thing that happens when you're like on a cliff on like a hang glider and you like go off the cliff? And I was like, no, I don't. And Tom, who's a pilot, was like, yeah, of course. And so I think that level of shaping really comes in the mix, I think, at least from what I...
And that was the first time I heard the air getting sucked out on the triangle, because in the music continued there, but you made everything stop, and I think that's so amazing. I mean, I think this is, because of all of this, one of the most epic openings of any documentary that I can think of ever, really.
I agree. Yeah, the image was telling me that it should stop,
Yeah.
and we should have, and in my view, like dynamic sound design and scoring and mixing is all about like rhythm and breathing and silence and loud and all the movement between. So that was a fun opportunity. I mean, this opening was like one of the most fun jobs could ever imagine working on. It was incredible.
We talked about that there was a fair amount of discussion between the music and the sound design in terms of sort of frequencies and how to handle certain things, but it also sounds like that there was a whole big crunch at the end, especially like sort of we're waiting for the lock, doing a lot of like work at the last minute, at least for the Sundance version. How did those sort of procedures balance out?
There was no balance. It was just pure, like, yeah, it was kind of crazy. We were just, yeah.
Yeah, we plowed through. But I think for the final mix, we did have enough time, and we wanted to have that time to be able to really shape and create that really fine-tuned journey. I think that the hang gliding moment came, I would say, after Sundance. But
yeah.
the which is when you enter the data wormhole. But really, we did accomplish a lot in those 2 days of our Sundance mix. And Tom is a genius and also a warrior in terms of like just plowing through so much. And you had done also a lot of a few days of a prep. Prepping for the mix, so a lot of those elements were already in, and he was doing a lot of pre-mixing. So when we came in, a lot of work had already been done by Tom and his team.
And that just from my experience, those crunches that happen on probably too many films, they're the most successful the more sort of prep that you've done, the more communication you've done in advance. So it's more like rushing to put the pieces together, not totally starting from scratch. And it really shows in all the prep work.
Yeah, on the music end for this opening, I was very conscious of the fact that we're going to be in a crunch, and so I made a conscious choice to have this be not melody based, because when things get re-edited and you have a melody, that's the hardest for a composer to reconform in a way that makes musical sense. So I kept it very much to an underpinning that could easily be edited, and like under the subway and all of that, you know, that's one of the areas where things got shorter, and so beats were removed, but you don't really hear it because it lends itself to that kind of last-minute editing. So as on the composer side, we're always thinking, how can we do things in a you know, in a powerful, effective, and economical way that we can adjust in a way that's sustainable, really, you know. And then there are other areas in the film that are much more melodic because they were more broad brushstrokes and lend themselves more to.
Like the next clip that we have.
Right.
It's
Well, quick question just before that. So Erin, when you were working with the animatics and stuff, what were you using for sound effects at that point?
So the animatics were actually something that Pedro, Kareem, and Jahan were upstairs looking at with our producer. They were quite bulky, and we never put them into the temp edit. So I think I glanced at them over your shoulder once, but I was very much on the same wavelength of what was going to be there. Like I understood, okay, this is the box part. This is once we're in the wormhole, and so. Obviously, once we had the animation, it was the horse leading the cart. But at that stage, it was almost like I was creating sounds to help imagine what the images might be. And a good example of that is the archive sound that we hear from the news clips. You know, Crooked Hillary tells lots of lies, like that section. And one of the things that, you know, it is their job and they get to it, and so I'm only doing it in a sound design, sound mix light version. But one of the things I think about when I am building these sound beds, especially when there aren't many visuals, is what is the foundation and what's a texture? And sometimes the visuals are the foundation, and we don't even have the visuals, but I'll say, okay, yes, like this archive's gonna come up, and even though normally I would mix that really high so we can hear every word, I'm imagining by the time we get to this place visually, we're already gonna be in a really disintegrated realm. And so already I was mixing that stuff to be pretty garbled and not as understandable and very textured, because that's a place where we wanted the visuals to take the lead and the sound cacophony to take the lead, not an individual sound. So there were things like that where, again, it was these sketches that hopefully were springboards into something much more fully fleshed out with these guys.
So taking all of this through the film, do you want to bring us to Wiley's World?
Wiley World. Sure. So I mean, this was another place where there were not visuals, and it was a similar idea of creating a polished landscape as we understand it, and evoking something incredibly familiar to all of us, so that when we started dissecting it and saying sketchy things about it, it would hit us personally, not just as a collective society, but as like an individual, like, what does this mean about my relationship with my device then? I relate to the polish. That feels like a world I inhabit, but you're saying it's this other world. So it was really about sort of setting people on a certain plane and then shaking that plane.
Yeah, really creating an intimacy, and then as Chris Wiley, who blew the whistle on Cambridge Analytica, talks about how a lot of people's data was harvested without their knowledge. It is really, instead of thinking your data, it is your personal belongings, your personal space, and it's in the invasion of that personal space. So really creating a feeling of an intimacy that will later then be violated. It's like someone coming into your house and taking your things. And so that was sort of the approach, both in music and sound, which we took when, putting this part of the section of the film together.
And it also seems to take a lot of the stuff that was already been developed earlier, and sort of
Exactly.
plays with it, twists it, and represents it in some ways. Can we go ahead and play clip 4? How much later in the film is this?
About 20 minutes.
So that was the full mix, and I have to say, like, I'm not really sure where the music ended, where the sound effects begin. Gil, do you want to tell us a little bit about the music in this scene?
Yeah. So, I think sometimes crazy deadlines create cool stuff. So, because this was, so the first half of it, so first of all, Erin, Pedro, and I had talked about this, this cue and talked about how we want to start it beautiful and more on the pretty side, and
Very intimate.
in the higher frequencies, something kind of more on the angelic side that invites you in, and before you know it, you're in it. And then Erin brought up that, she wants then the music to hit you on the low end, and so. So I think the opening part, the high angelic part, I did. Pedro, you were with me in the room, right?
Yeah.
So I was improvising with the sound. There was just no time to really compose. It was just play, just do it. And then after you left, I remained in the studio and I worked on the back half. And it was real time because, again, I had to deliver this. So I had my modular set up. I created this really cool patch, and I was watching the screen, and I was just tweaking knobs and recording all of it. And that was it. And then I added the low end afterwards, and that stem, by the way, is called Erin's Low Monsters. Very important. So yeah, this was very much a real time. Got to get it done. And I think, honestly, in my career so far, this is probably my bravest cue because I had no time to doubt myself. It was just like, do it. Yeah. And I went to bed thinking, I'm not sure about this. But I heard it in the morning. I was like, yeah, this works. So
Yeah, no, you really took us into that beautiful, intimate space and then beat us, stole our data, and it was really that unexpected, that violation of that really personal space, which was.
Well, and it's a space too where again this cue is like an underlying current, right? When we were talking earlier about the what's the main event here, what Wiley is saying and what Carol, the female voice you hear is the journalist asking him questions, what they're saying, that's horrifying. Like that is the main part there that you're that you should really be leaning in for. And the score and the sound design here, its brilliance really is that it leaves space to take that in and ride that current, and it accents and supports the right moments to emphasize and say, like, did you hear that? Or it's almost like this call and response between the sound design and music and what Wiley is saying.
And there's a place when we see the tall buildings where that's the first time some harmony comes in, and it's this harmony that has really nothing to do with anything, and it creates this vertigo feeling of like we've lost our sense of ground and North Star. It's just like hits you in the gut.
And what about the sound design aspect for the scene?
Yeah, I think this is a good example of the power of sort of creating vocabulary. So there are many, many, many sounds in the scene that you also heard in the first scene, and that sort of approach of picking and choosing a vocabulary, that certain elements have certain set sonic palettes, I think creates connections between those topics in the film.
And how much of this was revisited after Sundance as well? Did you spend more time on this section?
Yeah, wasn't this kind of new after Sundance, right? A lot of this
We fine-tuned.
refined.
We refined.
A lot of
yes.
different images, and I feel like a lot of this section, especially with the matrix of the connectivity and stuff, that was pretty new afterwards. So we had some time, and yeah.
Definitely the Enhoni and the visual, because the animation we also really fine-tuned after that, and along the lines with the sound design. But the cue was really that one all-nighter that.
So this was a pre-Sundance cue.
Yes, this was a lead up. The cue itself, the music itself was.
I think on the music, the cue remained, and just we moved the low end to catch certain cuts.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
I particularly enjoyed the mix of this section because it had such a defined arc that has been described, you know, from the intimate to this sort of scary, and then the sort of very analytical, you know, connectivity and the way that the narration was supported with the images and little subtle wishes in to just kind of emphasize things and the little data things that Jeremy made to connect the dots and everything. And that was really fun to work with the music bed and to be really subtle, but I think really effective.
And the in my mind, for some reason, I always keep thinking of the music as always like sort of balancing sort of all the sounds coming from different places. But you were reminding me that a lot of it is also sort of taking stuff out and like being provided with a palette and sort of picking what's the right thing in the right place and not using everything.
Right.
Do you want to? Can you talk a little bit about just sort of the mix overall?
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly that. I mean, we had a bunch of sound editors on this because of the time requirements, and we were just kind of like a little mini factory for a little while, creating a bunch of stuff. So I'm sitting there in the mix, and it was really Pedro and I in the mix, sitting next to each other, going through hundreds of tracks, and really trying to tell the story and go through and do a pass and get, oh, there's too much here, let's thin that out. And we really just found a way to flow through it and pick and choose at any given moment. And it's really shifting. This is more music, this is more sound design, this is about dialogue, this is about the ambience of going to this place in a realistic way. And it's really just kind of a dialogue that flows through.
Were any of you, because it was such a crunch getting to Sundance, did any of you, once you had a chance to sleep and then watch your Sundance cut, have any surprises of sort of what had come together?
I totally did. At the premiere, the next time I saw it at the premiere was it the Eccles or?
It was at the Mark, I
At
think.
the Mark. I was amazed at how good it sounded actually. After just like the insanity that went into making it, I was kind of a little nervous and expecting to be like, oh my God, that's what we thought was good at 5 a.m. But it actually sounded like a movie. I was impressed with us.
Congratulations.
I remember we sat next to each other.
Yeah.
And that was the first time we got to exhale together and go like, okay, here we go. I don't know. And it sounded amazing. And I remember two spots during the screening. Twice music came on and I was like, well, that's cool. Who wrote that? And I'd forgotten that I'd...
Hadn't slept yet.
Well, congratulations. So some questions from the audience?
I have less of a question and more of a comment in that, and I would just say that the musicality of the sound design and the textures of the music, I'm really impressed with how they've come together, and in watching it, it's such a unified piece that to cognitively have that divided is impossible, and it just comes together wonderfully. Like John Cage would be very proud of where things have gone since he was breaking down what was music and what was sound, and this is such a great place to hear you guys all break it out. Thank you very much for your time this morning.
Appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You mentioned this was ultimately an Atmos mix, not the Sundance, or did you
Sundance wasn't. Sundance was a 5.1 mix, but then we,
went back after and built it in?
right. Yeah, it was, and Netflix is doing a lot of Atmos in their streaming platform, and we worked with them and developed the Atmos, yeah.
When did Netflix come on board with the film?
Right at the
From the
from the get go. Back when it was still a Sony hack film, they stuck with us
Great.
through the many different iterations
Kudos
on the
to them.
development. Yeah.
Do you have any advice for sound engineers who are trying to make their way into the film or TV industry?
Yeah, intern. You know, there was a young man who showed up just as we were doing this as an intern, and he just went to our website and applied and did the little Pro Tools test and showed up as an intern and turned out to be a wonderful person who now is a full-time engineer, sound designer at Gigantic. So it's, yeah, I mean, obviously play, do great work hard, develop a skill set, and then show up somewhere, because the fact is everyone is always looking for talented people. So if you're good, you'll do well.
I think also I think there's sometimes an obsession with gear, especially coming from the music world, which I also work in sometimes. Like there can be an obsession with gear and technology, and that sort of stuff is really, those tools are important to do what we do, but ultimately it's about storytelling. And as much as you can immerse yourself in that is good, but also on the flip side, thinking, for instance, about your hang glider, like key is to be out in the world and listen to the world, and there's so many places to take inspiration other than just in a studio or in a movie theater that can really inform your work in really powerful ways.
I don't think it's an obsession, though. It's an addiction.
Yeah.
Full
or a
blown.
crutch sometimes.
Full blown.
Oh,
Other questions?
I just want to give a quick shout out. In the audience, there's one of our team members, Daniel Claridge, who did a lot of worked very closely with the Shy Kids on the animation, and a lot of the animations I actually see was Daniel working with the Shy Kids, and so he really, and also in doing a lot of the temp sound design, and really helped. What we eventually saw is really thanks to him. So, Daniel.
Give time, I think, for another question or two. I think it was a great film. I really enjoyed watching it. Congratulations on doing it. Any other thoughts on sort of how would you do anything different next time?
Well, I think it turned out, and I think we're all really proud of this film and really happy with the way it turned out. Maybe a little more sleep, but hey, it was sitting at Sundance, listening to that mix. It was like, oh, okay, that was,
Deadlines are good. I have a feeling in our
So-
industry, like very little would get done without
It's
deadlines.
more. I think one of the things is, and I think we all are guilty of this on this panel, is that the full immersion into the work, and when you're living and breathing in it, it actually really, I think, comes through in a certain way. And I think on this project, it really paid off.
And I just from the outside, just like it really tremendously sort of brought everything together in sort of a seamless whole, which you don't sort of feel that on this level that often. So truly, congratulations.
I think part of that comes from Kareem and Jahan, who choose their people, and we all have so much respect for them and for what they're trying to do, and the dedication to their vision that we all just aligned. I mean, there were no egos, there was no conflict. There was all of us trying to do the best that we could and working together, and it was a really harmonious process.
Yeah, we were really a tight family, and they've put a lot of faith in their collaborators, and always guiding us with the most incredible storytelling. And the most incredible characters. So.
What's the next project?
I think
I'm editing a series with Liz Garbus for HBO about Michelle McNamara and her obsession with an investigation of the Golden State Killer.
I'm directing a documentary feature about a group of, for lack of a better word, rebel nuns from the late 60s in Los Angeles. So.
Excellent.
We have a big slate of Sundance hopeful projects, including 4 hours of Hillary Clinton for Hulu, which Nanette Bernstein is directing. That's our current this week project.
I'm working on an interactive museum exhibit about linguistics in Washington, D.C.
Also working on a few Sundance hopeful films and a IMAX 3D film and an Atlantic documentary on the alt-right.
Wow, that will be interesting. Thank you all very much. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
And,
Thanks
enjoy.
for coming.